Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining our first SDEC webinar. While we're going through, if you have any technical difficulties, got a coworker, Stu Schilling, helping out. You can go ahead and use the chat area in the Zoom, and we'll kind of walk through. So this is going to be a session on Adobe Analytics, and we're going to talk about report suites. Before we get started, just wanted to kind of do an introduction and do a little housekeeping before we dive into the actual content. My name is Adam Greco, and I work for Search Discovery. My background is I was one of the early employees of Omniture. Spent about 20 years working with the Adobe Analytics product. Been part of over 1,000 implementations and ran the implementation at Salesforce and other companies. And I wrote the book for Adobe on the product. And some of you probably read some of my countless blog posts out there. Currently, I'm working on a product that helps people improve their Adobe Analytics implementations called Apollo. So the search discovery education community is something that we just started, and our goal is to provide free education for anyone who wants it. We do have a lot of topic areas. This is going to be an Adobe Analytics session. But just in case you didn't sign up for one of the other topic areas, if you want to join one that you didn't initially fill out the form for, you can go ahead and DM me in the Slack group, and I can add you to the distribution list. I send out emails for each of the webinars and put them in the Slack group as well. So far, we've been at this for about 3 to 4 weeks, I think we're a little under a month, and we've been blown away by the response. So far, as of a couple of minutes ago when I checked, we're at 1,272 members in 60 countries, 483 cities, and we are at just about 1,000 people in the Adobe Analytics group, which is really cool. We do want to make this available to anybody who wants it. So if you have anyone that you know of that you'd like to join, we've got a bit.ly link there that is just bit.ly SDI SDEC if you want to join. Okay, next. In order to help us to help you, there's a couple things that I've been emailing you all about that I'd love to see if you could help with. If you can join the Slack group, it really helps out because I'm getting lots of feedback that people are not getting emails that either I send or Zoom sends. Right now, about 70% of the 1,200 people are in the Slack group. If you can make a point, it takes just a minute to click on the link and join. If you have an expired link, just send me an email and I can send you the new link. But basically, in the Slack group is an easier way for me to communicate with everyone. Also, if you can make your Slack username and display name your full name, we have a lot of people with the same name and it makes it really tricky for me to make sure everyone's getting the right invite. So if you can do that, that really helps out a lot. From an email perspective, here are the 2 email addresses that you should add to your contacts, sdec@searchdiscovery.com and noreply@zoom.us. That will make sure that you get all of the future webinar invites. And if your organization does not allow you to use Zoom, and you're watching this recording and you wanted to come live but you couldn't watch Zoom, just DM me and we have another way that we can provide a live feed for those who are having problems with Zoom. And then as we go through the webinar today, there is a Q&A that we're going to do at the end. So if you have questions along the way, post them in Zoom and just post the Q&A there. We will address them either in real time or we'll get to them at the end. And when the session is done, we will have a recording of it in the Adobe Analytics channel in Slack. So that's the housekeeping, and now let's dive in. So let's talk about report suites in Adobe Analytics. So report suites can be used for lots of different ways. And I think of report suites as kind of like a little wall that you're putting around your websites that you are tracking with Adobe Analytics. Now you can have a different report suite because maybe you have different types of websites, or you could have different report suites because you have different countries. Maybe you want to have a different data set for every country. Or you might have different brands. So for example, maybe Bed Bath and Beyond has a company. They have Cost Plus World Market. They have Bed Bath and Beyond. They have Bye Bye Baby. So they might have a company where they have one company login, but they want to have a different report suite for every brand. And also you can use report suites to split things out. Like maybe you want to have a desktop report suite or a mobile app report suite. So there's lots of different reasons to use report suites. And the hard part about report suites is a lot of times people make this decision when they first start with Adobe Analytics, and that's kind of when you know the least about Adobe Analytics. So sometimes people don't really set up themselves for success to begin with. But I would just have you think about, where do you kind of draw the line between different digital properties, and that might be where you think about doing different report suites. Now, each report suite has its own time zone and its own currency. And this becomes really important because if you sell things on your website, you might have different locations, like maybe the UK and the US, where they use different currencies. And it can get tricky if you don't translate that on the fly. But if you want to see the different currencies in the reports, then you have to actually use a different report suite, because you can only have one currency per report suite. That may change in the future, but that's the way it is right now. And the time zone is important because all of the hits that come in are going to be tied to that time zone. So if your business is primarily, say, East Coast US, then that's probably where you want to set your time zone. But if you do have different report suites, you can have different time zones. It just might get confusing to people when they're kind of comparing data across multiple report suites. So those are two things that I always recommend that you keep in mind when you're setting up your report suite. Now, there are obviously two types of report suites in Adobe Analytics. For many years, there was only what I call a traditional report suite, which back then was just a report suite. But now that we have virtual report suites, I affectionately call them traditional report suites. And these are report suites where the data is basically collected in real time, normally through a JavaScript tag. There are some other ways you can collect data, but usually through a tag management system. Many of you are probably using Adobe Launch. And so that's basically just, I'm collecting data via JavaScript. Now, a virtual report suite is something that came out several years ago. And the idea of a virtual report suite is that it's basically a regular report suite, but segmented. And so it's kind of like a fake report suite, in that it takes all the data from its parent report suite, and then it applies a segment, and then it filters the data. And so that allows you to really customize what data you want to analyze. Now, you can have as many virtual report suites as you want. I probably wouldn't recommend creating a virtual report suite for every segment that you've ever created, because you probably have hundreds or thousands of segments. But I would generally think about using a virtual report suite when there's a segment that is pretty important, and it's something that you might use on an ongoing basis, that instead of having to go to a regular report suite and always having to apply a segment, you would just go to the virtual report suite. Now, I'm going to cover some of the gotchas with virtual report suites, but some high level things is that the data is going to be slightly delayed. It takes a couple extra minutes for it to get processed into the virtual report suite. You're not going to have real-time data, so you can't use any of the real-time reports. The good part of virtual report suites is that it doesn't cost you additional server calls. And we'll get into a little more about that later. And another cool thing is that you can actually adjust the visit duration. So if you don't like the out-of-the-box Adobe saying that a visit is 30 minutes, you can change that in a virtual report suite. So here's kind of an example, a couple examples of a virtual report suite. So on the left, I made a virtual report suite where I said, you know what, I have two segments, where one is that I want to exclude bad data. And these are things that I found that either someone made tagging errors or is just bad data altogether. And then maybe I have a segment that I've used to figure out what are bots hitting my site. And so I would call this maybe my clean virtual report suite, where I tell people, go use this report suite because it's a little more clean and it's got better data. Another example might be, for some reason, you might want to just have some analysis that focuses on visits that had an order. So in this case, we can use a segment that says, I want to look at only visits that had an order. And now, anytime you're really just focused on actual customers, people who are ordering, you could go there and look and not have to worry about segmenting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can change the visit definition, the time, for the timeout of the visit. Now, you want to definitely read the documentation here and make sure that you're not kind of shooting yourself in the foot. But you can decide, maybe I want to make a visit only 15 minutes. Or maybe if you have a mobile app, you want to get it down to 1 minute or 5 minutes, something really much smaller, which may be more realistic. So this is a way that you can make your data a little more flexible, but still have real-time data processing. Now, another use that I've done for virtual report suites is to think about making them for levels of users and their sophistication. So in virtual report suites, you can manually choose what elements, and when I say elements, I mean success events, EVARs, SPROPs, segments, are moved over into the virtual report suite. So maybe you have some people who are beginners in Adobe Analytics and you say, you know what, I don't want to overwhelm them with 200 EVARs. I want to just give them the bare bones stuff that they need. So you can make a beginner report suite. Maybe you have an intermediate report suite. Maybe you have an advanced report suite. So lots of different ways you can do it. And that's kind of a cool way that you could ease people in to Adobe Analytics and not overwhelm them. And you get to choose exactly what elements you want in the report suite. Now, some other uses that I think about when I think about virtual report suites is, do I want to change the visit duration? Do I want to be able to exclude things like bots? Maybe I have fraudulent orders that I found out are no good. You know, I want to take those out so they don't mess up my data. I mentioned maybe limiting the report access based on user proficiency. You could have different virtual report suites for different sites or different brands. Maybe you want to do a different virtual report suite for desktop versus mobile. And if you have tagging mistakes, like I one time had a client that instead of someone ordering something for $100, it came in as $1 million. And then that screwed up all of the reporting for weeks and even year over year. So you can take that out in the virtual report suite. And then another cool use of virtual report suites is if you have a third party that you work with, maybe an ad agency or someone that you want to share some of your data with, but not all of the data, you can set up a virtual report suite and just give them access to certain reports because there's full security capabilities around virtual report suites. So after I kind of extol all the benefits of regular report suites and virtual report suites, the question I often get is, should I use the old fashioned or should I use a virtual? So I kind of like to think of the gotchas when I make this decision. So I'm going to give you kind of the Adam Greco rule of thumb here. If you need to see current data or real-time data, like you really need to see the data up to the minute as best as you can in Adobe, then don't use a virtual report suite. That's not going to help you. Now, you can still have a virtual report suite, but for the real-time needs, you'd have to go to the main report suite. Second, and this is the most important one, if you are building a virtual report suite, the odds are you are using a segment to do it. If that segment leverages a dimension like an EVAR or an SPROP that encounters the low traffic, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but for some newbies here, Adobe can only store about 500,000 unique values in a dimension in a month. Now you can pay more money and you can work with your account manager to extend that. I think the max is about 2 million unique elements. But if you are basing your dimension, your segment for your virtual report suite on a dimension that breaks that 500K low traffic limit, what that means is that you are only going to get data into your virtual report suite for the first 500,000 values. That is problematic because now you have a virtual report suite that's not actually showing you all of your data. So I would generally recommend that you try to avoid making virtual report suites using a segment that hits that limit. A classic example might be you have search terms and maybe you have over 500,000 search terms in a month. That's not something you would want to build a virtual report suite on because you may not get all of the data. Another thing related to that is if you are using a Saint classification or a metadata attribute off of a dimension that breaks the 500K limit, you will also not want to build your virtual report suite off of that in that segment. And a classic example of this is, let's say you have 10 million customers and each of them have a unique ID that you've hashed and put in an EVAR. And then maybe you've done a same classification that says, okay, these customers are men and these customers are women, and you've got that in Adobe Analytics. The problem is that if you try to make a male or female virtual report suite, you're only going to get the men and women from the first 500,000 customer IDs, not all 10 million. So it still hits that low traffic limit. So just think about that when you're building your virtual report suites and building the segments. Another thing that virtual report suites don't have is data feeds. So data feeds are only applicable to the actual traditional report suite that the virtual report suite is built off of. So if you want a data feed, you're going to have to go back to the regular report suite. And if you want a data feed that's similar to what you've got in your virtual report suite, then you'd have to kind of parse it yourself and kind of make it match the segment that you have in your virtual report suite. And as I mentioned earlier, virtual report suites, like regular report suites, can only have one currency. So they inherit the currency of the parent report suite. So if you want to have different currencies, then you're going to have to use different report suites or have a different virtual report suite for each and do some sort of translation. So that's another kind of thing that's problematic. So these are some of the biggest gotchas that I've seen when it comes to virtual report suites. Now, another question I get is, should I use one report suite or should I use multiple report suites? And this can be very tricky because there's lots of different pros and cons. But in general, I have found that there's really three different options when it comes to report suites. One is to send all of your data into one report suite, and then that's all you have is one regular report suite, and then you split out any other derivations you want there into virtual report suites. The second option is to send all of your data to individual report suites. So you've got maybe one for brand A, brand B, or country A, country B, but then also have a master report suite that gets all the data, which we sometimes call a global report suite. And since you're sending data to both a low-level report suite and a global, you're sending two tags, which we call multi-suite tagging. Now that will obviously cost you more money because you're basically doubling your server calls. And Adobe loves it when you do this, but your accountants may not love it when you do that. And then option three is to say, you know what, I'm not going to have a master view of all of my data. I'm going to just have data at the individual report suite level. So maybe brand A, brand B, country A, country B, but I'm not going to be able to see the data for all of it together. So these are really the three different options that you have. So what I've made for you is to think about like, what makes sense for your business? How much money do you want to spend on server calls and so on? So there's many benefits to having either a single report suite or a global that takes all of the data into one report suite. If it's set up consistently, then you can see success event totals across all of your websites. You could basically roll up. So if you have orders or maybe you like room bookings, you can see it for all of your websites because it's all either in the same report suite or it's all feeding into a global suite from all the subsuites. If you want to build a segment and have that segment span a couple of your websites or apps, you can do it. So for example, let's say I have a US website and a UK website, and for some reason I want to build a segment that says, I want to look at people who looked at the UK website, but maybe a product wasn't available there. It was only available on the US website, so they actually ordered on the US website. And maybe that segment helps me figure out which products I need to sell in both sites. That is only possible if you happen to have a report suite that is collecting data from the UK and the US, all of that together in one. So again, either a global suite or a single suite that has everything. You might also want to think about marketing campaign performance. How many times did someone come to one of my websites from a campaign, but then actually traverse to another one of my websites and order or do some other KPI? If you don't have everything in one master suite, then you will lose the campaign performance effect because basically the second site of yours that they go to will look like a referrer from your first site, but it won't carry forward the campaign code. So your campaign reporting can actually be off if you don't see all of your data in one suite. Obviously, if you have either one suite or a global suite, you can deduplicate your unique visitors, which is great. So you could actually see, not overcount your unique visitors. And then lastly, if you do have one unified view of your data, you can see people navigating through pathing reports between different sites. So you can see how many people went to site A and then jumped over to site B, maybe went back to site A. So these are just some of the benefits of having either a single or a master global report suite. Now, to make your life a little bit easier, this is not something we're going to be able to go through in terrible depth now, but I made a grid of things that I think about when it comes to this decision and some of the things that I think about. So at a high level, if you want to limit your cost of server calls, if you just don't want to spend a lot of money with Adobe, then basically having one report suite is a great thing to do and use virtual report suites. Or you could just do individual report suites and not have a global, but then you kind of miss out on some of the benefits I just mentioned. But you don't want to do both. You don't want to have individual suites and a global if you're looking to save money. If you want to see that unified view of all your reporting that includes all those benefits I just talked about in terms of pathing, deduplicated visitors and segments and all that, then you either need to have one report suite that has everything and just do virtual report suites, or you need to have a global master suite that has everything. And if you do the individual report suites, you're out of luck. You're not going to be able to do that. If you want to build segments across all of your digital properties, again, your option is to use the first option or the second option, and you're not going to be able to do it in the individual suite option. If you happen to have a segment that you really need to build and it's based on that low traffic, you're pretty much in trouble anyway, but you're really in trouble if you use the one report suite with virtual report suites. You might be able to get by in some cases with the global and the individual suites, because sometimes what I found is that you don't hit the 500K limit. If you think about it at the individual site level, you only start to hit that 500K limit when you bring all of your sites together. So that one might be bad across the board, but if you're right around 500K as a whole company, or maybe 2 or 3 million as the whole company, you might actually be okay if you do the individual report suite approach. And again, if you want to see data in pretty real time, then the virtual report suites is not going to be a great option for you, but the global and the individual suites will be. And if you want to see a different currency for everything, then you're pretty much going to be kind of tied to one of these options. So hopefully that grid kind of helps you kind of think about the decisions. And I would highly recommend that if you can, you consider moving down to the first option. Most of the companies that I work with are moving down to just having one report suite and then doing virtual report suites, because virtual report suites have gotten pretty good and it just makes your implementation much easier to manage. Now, that leads me to the last point I wanted to cover today, which is report suite consistency. So many times when I work with Adobe Analytics customers, I find that they have lots of different report suites. And when I look in the admin console, and maybe I'm looking at success events or EBARs, here I'm looking at success events, I find that they haven't done a really good job of making their report suites consistent. And that's when you'll see the word multiple all over here. I used to call this multiple madness. And it basically means that you've got maybe 5 or 10 report suites and they're not set up the same way, because if they were, then Adobe would show the actual variable name here that's consistent across all of them. Now, this is one of the reasons why going down to one report suite is just better, because you never have this issue because you only have one report suite to deal with. But in order to go down to one report suite, it's kind of difficult if you're in this multiple madness world. So I would highly recommend that even if you end up in a world where you have 50 or 100 report suites, that you do your best to try to make sure that all of it is set up exactly the same way. Event one should always be the same success event across all of them. Even if a certain report suite isn't using it, I would still name it the same, and then you could always just hide it or disable it, because there's a lot of benefits of having report suite consistency. One of the things that you see if you consistently name everything and have all the same settings is that when your end users are using Adobe Analytics, whether they're using the old interface or they're using the new analysis workspace, they can easily switch reporting anytime they want by just switching the report suite. But what's really frustrating is if someone is in, maybe let's say they're in EVAR 10, and that's internal search term, and they're looking at it with success event 2 which is internal searches. And then they switch from, say, Germany to the UK. If the UK suite isn't using EVAR 10 and Success Event 2 for the same things, then things get really complicated, because then it'll basically change to the same report, but you're going to be looking at different data. But if you have everything set up consistently, they can float between different report suites and virtual report suites without having any problems. Another thing is, when you build a segment, oftentimes you want to have a segment where you build it once and then you can use that many different places. You can use it in any report suite. And if you have the same setup, then the segment definition can be created once and then just shared across all the different report suites. But if you have different EVARs and SPROPs and events in different variable slots or variable numbers, then you'd actually have to make a different segment for each report suite with the different variable numbers, which is just not scalable, and it just doesn't make any sense. The same applies to calculated metrics. Calculated metrics could get pretty complicated when you make the definitions, and I don't know why anyone would want to make the same calculated metric 50 times for 50 different report suites just because someone was lazy and didn't end up putting the variables in the right slots. Having the same implementation overall also simplifies your QA process, because you can basically build certain QA tests and scripts, and you know that they'll work on any website, any report suite. It also simplifies your tagging and your tag management, so you can set up the same rules and you don't have to kind of have like this kind of Frankenstein version of tagging. It also means that your documentation can be much more simplified. So you've got kind of one set of specs that could be given to developers that work everywhere. Another thing is, when it comes to training, if you want to train people, it's nice that you can be able to say, here's a training video I've made, and it's for internal search, and it will work across all report suites because everyone is set up the same way. It also, believe it or not, users do end up, whether they like it or not, memorizing things. Like, they end up learning that EVAR 5 is this and SPROP 10 is that. So once they learn it, it makes it much easier for them to kind of know what they're doing. But if you end up making them learn different variable numbers in different report suites, like, they're going to literally hate you. So that's another benefit. So again, I would highly recommend that you think about setting up your report suites consistently. And if you do go to one report suite, a lot of these problems kind of go away. So that's all I really wanted to cover in today's session. I meant to mention this in the beginning, but we're going to kind of, in the Adobe Analytics series here, kind of start with the basics. As you can tell, for some people who may not be super experts at Adobe Analytics, especially people who right now have been furloughed or out of work, and they're looking to kind of build up their skill base to get into Adobe Analytics. So the next couple sessions I'm going to do are kind of go through the basics. I'm going to talk about metrics. I'm going to talk about dimensions and so on. So hopefully that was helpful for you to learn a little bit more about report suites and just kind of think about how you're positioning report suites and virtual report suites and report suite consistency at your organization. So now I'm going to turn over to questions. And so if you have any questions that you'd like us to tackle, I'm going to do that now. So I'm going to take a peek and see what we've got here. So the first one, someone had said, have we managed to achieve similar virtual report suite results with a good workspace project? So I'm not 100% sure I understand that question. So let me see. Hey, so Stu, I'm just catching up here. Will you fill me in on how we're doing with questions here?
Yes, so there's been a mix of questions coming in. Some have been in the Q&A, and some have been in the chat. I slacked you a compiled list that has them all together if you want to run through them from your Slack.
Cool, yeah, so the first one, I'm not 100% sure I get the question. Have we managed to achieve similar virtual reports results with a good workspace project? So as far as I know, in my experience, when you're in Workspace, you should see pretty much everything in the virtual report suite that you should. I don't know of any Workspace limitations, but maybe someone can clarify that question for me a little bit, and I'll move on to the next one. So the three bad for global plus virtual report suite are really just bad for virtual report suites. Yeah, so some of the, and I'll jump back to that slide. So some of the bad ones here are mainly bad for the virtual report suite. Obviously, the one report suite you have is always the best scenario. Like you're going to be fine because you've got the best of both worlds. The problem is that you may not, the segments when you do the virtual report suite is the problem. So this is a problem overall. Low traffic is just a general problem, but you would have the near real time in the main report suite. You just wouldn't have that in the virtual report suite. And so when I did this column, I was more thinking like, if a brand or a country was only leveraging the virtual report suite, would it be good or bad? Keep in mind that they can always go back to the main report suite. It's just some companies I work with, they actually give people access to the virtual report suite and they don't give them access to the main report suite. And that does bring up one other point. If you are really a drastic administrator of Adobe Analytics, there is an argument to be made that you should never give someone access to the real report suite, like the actual report suite, and only give them access to the virtual report suite. It's not for everybody, but it's something that I've done for some clients. And the reason is because in the real report suite, it's really difficult to take out bad data other than educating people that they always have to add a segment. But if you only give them access to a clean report suite, then they would never see the bad data. They would never have to even think about the segment being applied. However, the downside is that you have to make sure that that virtual report suite doesn't use something that uses the low traffic issue, and it doesn't have a need for real time, and there's no currency issue. Next one here. Wouldn't currency be a crucial factor for multinational companies? Yes, absolutely. Now, I have seen some multinational companies that what they do is they standardize on one currency, and they decide, you know what, we want to build these virtual report suites and we want to save money. So we're going to do everything in one currency. And then you don't have the currency issue. I also have seen a little trick that I've done for some clients that what we've done is we've passed the actual currency of that country, not to a currency event, but more to like a numeric success event, so that you can document what was the dollar amount in the local currency in the implementation, but the numeric success event isn't impacted when it comes to the currency translation that happens with multi-suite tagging. So you can kind of report on one currency like US dollars everywhere, but you could store like British pounds and euros in a particular numeric event. And then you could always download that to a spreadsheet and apply the currency, or you could use a calculated metric to apply the currency there. Another question that came in, will it be possible to share the slides too? So in general with the SDC, what we're hoping is that people will watch the recordings where you get much more context. We have no problem with sharing the slides, but we're really at this point only going to be sharing the recording, just because there are going to be some presentations we do where customers are going to be presenting content and we can't go through legal stuff. So we are doing this kind of as a side project. So for now, we're going to recommend that you share the webinar. And what I'd recommend you do is, since it's free, if there's other people at your company who want to join, rather than sharing the link with them, have them join. And that really is important for us because we're actually paying money to Zoom to be able to have the right number of people who can attend. And we want to make sure that people who are in the group are not locked out of a Zoom webinar because there will be some limits because people who aren't in the group. So it just helps us make sure we're right sizing anything, but I would just share the webinar with anyone who you work with. Okay. Okay, now the questions are really coming in. Okay, so what is the difference, or you might want to mention a dev versus a prod report. So yeah, good point. So many of you know that when you set up Adobe Analytics, you're going to automatically have a couple report suites because you're going to want to set up a one for development, maybe QA, and maybe prod. So everything that I'm mentioning here, whether you have one report suite and use virtual, is all assuming that we're talking about the prod report suite. But you might also end up having a dev report suite just as you're testing things out in QA, but not really using that for your virtual report suite. So yeah, that is a good point. You will probably end up having a dev suite, but that won't really cost you very much money because you're probably not going to have that much volume going into that. Next one, someone asked a question about roll-up report suites. There is a reason I didn't mention roll-up report suites, because they really suck. I would not recommend that you really do anything with roll-up report suites, because basically it's just a summation of data. The nice part is that they're free. The bad part is that they're kind of useless because you can't see pathing across stuff. You can't deduplicate unique visitors. There are a number of downsides with roll-up suites, so I just generally stay away from them. I guess if you had a couple metrics that you wanted to just sum up and you weren't using a global, but I would highly recommend you just use a global instead of using a roll-up. I'm just not a big fan of those. Next question, for multiple report suites, how would you determine how to go about starting the process of aligning across multiple regions? Would you take care of a this way approach, communicate early, deal with comes kind of way? So yeah, if you have to go from multiple report suites down to one, like that's kind of a tricky process and it takes some time. First of all, you have to kind of rationalize, make sure all of the implementation is consistent. And you'd have to look in this case across different regions and just see if they have the same business needs. But like I said earlier, I'd highly recommend that regardless of whether you do this, even if you're thinking that you're going to keep many report suites for the next 2 years, I would standardize them over the next 6 months now, because then it's just literally a flip of a switch to either go down to one or to basically get rid of all those report suites. It's just really easy to do. And if you need help taking like 10 different implementations you have and going down to one, like please feel free to ping me. I've done this for years. I've seen kind of good ways that you can do that, but it does take some time. So I have a customer that would like to see the entire journey between brands. The best approach would be creating a global report suite and after segment by brand. So yeah, so if you do want, if they have multiple brands and multiple brand websites, then you would kind of go back into this grid and say, okay, well, I'm either going to put it into one and then split out a different virtual report suite for brand, or I would use a global report suite and have to pay some extra money to Adobe to be able to see people floating between the different brands. So yeah, that's a good use case of either option 1 or option 2 in this. How to manage a visit number at the virtual report suite level. So this one I might have to do some research on. I can't recall today how Adobe does it, unless Stu, you know how Adobe does the visit number at the virtual report suite level. I'd have to check. That might be a Jen Lasser question. Stu, do you happen to know that?
I would guess it is simply the same that you would see within any segment, that it's operating off of the data that it gets.
Yeah, I would believe so too, but that'd be something just to kind of test out. The next question we have is, can we change time zone or currency at the report suite level once set up? So I might defer to you on this one, Stu. I believe you can, but I think that it does have some negative ramifications. Have you ever done that, Stu?
Changing time zone on a report suite?
So I have changed the time zone, and what you'll see is a one-time gap in the data. I haven't changed the currency. So I've never been gutsy enough to try that. So I assume there'd be that the old stuff would be in the old currency and the new stuff would be in the new, but that I probably would caution against that.
I don't know if you can actually do it. And the big question comes up about currency conversion. So when you set the currency on your report suite, you can send the data into that report suite using s.currency that doesn't match the report suite currency. And so that data is coming in, and if your currency on your report suite is US dollars, but the currency on the tag coming in is Swiss francs, then it's going to do a conversion on that in post-processing based on the conversion rates at that time. And so After the fact, if you were to go to a report suite and say, hey, I want to change this from US dollars to CHF, it's kind of a teaser, like what's it gonna do with that data that already exists, and how is it going to treat that from a conversion rate standpoint? So I question whether it's even possible.
Yep.
And we can certainly get back on that. It's piqued my interest now, because I can't see it as being something even viable.
Yep. Okay, so we have a couple minutes left, and now the questions are coming in fast and furious. So what I think we're going to have to do is maybe tackle one or two more, and then I'm going to see, I'm new to Zoom, so I think we should be able to get all of these questions. And so what I think I might do is see if we can do like a Q&A and post it as a document in the Slack group. So that's going to be my go-to. We'll see if that works. There were a couple questions that came in, and I just want to clarify this around what I talked about with the low traffic issue, both on the dimension and at using the same classification. So just to reiterate, when you use a virtual report suite, you are 9 times out of 10 going to be using a segment to build that virtual report suite. If you don't use a segment, the really only benefit of a virtual report suite is just changing like the visit duration and what components are in it. So I would say 90% of the time, there's probably a segment that you're using. When you build a segment, segments can only work at everything that is underneath the low traffic limit, whatever your low traffic limit is for your dimension. So if you happen to build a segment that you're using for a virtual report suite, and that particular segment uses a dimension that hits the low traffic, then in the virtual report suite, it's going to basically only look at the first 500,000 roughly values, and everything beyond that is going to be ignored and not moved over to the virtual report suite. So it'll be almost like a sampling. So I don't want to freak anyone out, but I just want you to be aware of this. So what you really want to think about is when you're building a segment for a virtual report suite, does it use an EVAR and SPROP? That's the first question. If the answer is yes, then you need to go look at that EVAR and SPROP, all of the ones being used, and say, does it ever hit the unique limit? And if so, then you got to think twice about whether that's what you want, or you need to work with Adobe to up your unique limit. And if you're building your virtual report suite on a same classification of a dimension that hits the unique limit, the same problem will apply. So that's what you want to think about. One question came in, does a staging report suite cost the same as a production? So report suites don't cost you anything. What they basically do is server calls is what cost you something. So you can have 100 report suites. If you're not sending any data to them, you're not charged any money. So a QA report suite only costs you as much as the data that you're sending to it. So I don't want to keep people beyond our time. So I want to first of all thank everyone for joining. We had almost, I think, 300 people join for the first one, which is great. I will be posting the recording in the Slack group. If you have questions, concerns, comments, you could always email me at sdec@searchdiscovery.com or adamgreco@searchdiscovery.com. We will be having another session on Thursday with Simo Ahava, and he's going to be talking about some cool stuff with browsers and cookies. So highly recommend that you check that one out, and we will see you on Thursday. So thank you so much for joining.